So welcome everybody. My talk today is about Eclipse, the past, present, and future. I'm going to do a little bit of a history lesson, a little bit of a status update, and then talk about what I think of as some of the cool and interesting things that are happening with the Eclipse Foundation. And by the way, this is an Eclipse Foundation talk. Obviously, it's a developer audience, so I'm going to be talking quite a bit about various technologies. But some of the things that we're going to touch on is the Eclipse Foundation as an organization as well. This is sort of a recap, largely a recap of the keynote that I gave at EclipseCon in North America back in March, which was actually, interestingly enough, that was my 10th EclipseCon North America. It was the first time I'd ever talked there, because I always thought that it was sort of bad taste for the executive director to talk at his own conference. But I figured once every 10 years wouldn't be such a bad idea. And you know, one of the things to understand is that our goal, not just me, but everybody who works at the Eclipse Foundation, our goal is to turn the Eclipse Foundation into an institution that lasts in the technology industry for a great many years to come. And so this is not sort of like an entrepreneurial startup kind of approach to what we're building, but much more of an institutional kind of approach. So just a little bit on me. You know, obviously my day job is I'm the executive director of the Eclipse Foundation, but I also am fairly involved in the broader Java and open source worlds. I'm both a director and the treasurer of the Open Source Initiative, which is the organization that created the term open source, and to this day is the keeper of the definition of what it means to be an open source license. I'm also on the executive committee of the Java community process, and I've been there for 6 years. Frankly, I think I deserve some sort of medal, because it's really hard going in those conversations. I'm also, I was one of the founding directors and now an observer on the board of OpenJDK, so I'm pretty involved in sort of all of the aspects of Java governance. So how many people in the audience, put up your hand if you use Eclipse? All right, what's Eclipse? Okay, all right, put up your hand up if you've never heard of Eclipse and you have no idea what I'm talking about. All right, so everybody at least has heard of Eclipse. How many people, put your hand up if you wish you'd never heard of Eclipse. It's got to be a couple guys. Yeah, there's the IntelliJ lovers. They're always there. But part of what I'm going to, you know, the subliminal message for this talk, by the way, is, and hopefully by the end it's much more explicit, is that, you know, people strongly correlate the word Eclipse with the Java IDE. And that's both been a huge part of our success, but it's also been kind of a pain in the backside because we do so many other things besides that Java IDE. You know, just for example, if you know people that are in the world of embedded software development think of Eclipse as a C environment. But we also have we have over 250 projects at Eclipse, including things that you probably don't even realize are at Eclipse, like Jetty, for example, is an Eclipse project, or Vertex is an Eclipse project. So we do a lot of different things. So turning back, okay, to the very beginning of Eclipse. So the Eclipse technology was first launched in November 2001, and it was really started off as a development project inside IBM. You know, several years before that. And, you know, it was immediately a huge success from a PR point of view. You know, one of the very first times I think an open source project made the pages of the New York Times. Has more, I think, more to say about the IBM public relations machine than it does about Eclipse, but it was extremely big news at the time. And you know, it was slash-dotted. It was very popular. And the reason why I think it was popular is that at the time that Eclipse was launched in 2001, it really was a large improvement over the state-of-the-art for Java development tools. You know, at that time, NetBeans, for example, was not nearly as good as it is today. Even IntelliJ was not nearly as good as it is today. And having completely free and open source tools for Java developers have been a huge part of the success of Java as well as the success of Eclipse. But why did IBM open source Eclipse? So it's a fairly long and complicated story, but at the heart, IBM open sourced Eclipse because they wanted Java to be successful. And they looked at that time at the tools for Java and saw a highly fractured landscape. I'm old, I got gray hair, been around for a long time. If you can think back into the late 1990s and 2000, the world of Java was things like JBuilder, Visual Age for Java, Visual Cafe, of course NetBeans, WebGain Studio. I mean these were the tools that were out there, and none of them really had more than 20 or 25% of the market share, and quite a few of them were not all that great. And IBM's hopes for Java was that it would provide a platform to compete directly against .NET for enterprise software development. And Visual Studio was great, and most enterprise developers worked on Windows. So what IBM wanted to do is create a tooling platform for Java that looked great on Windows, worked great on Windows, as well as Linux and the Mac, and was available to everybody in the hopes that they could create a tooling ecosystem for Java that rivaled the strength of Visual Studio for Windows and .NET. One of the things that they did that was a little bit different, and I think this Eclipse was, we think of this as being very normal today, but Eclipse was actually the first one to do this, which was the day that they launched Eclipse as an open source project. They also created a consortium of industry players to support that open source project. And this notion of marrying a consortium to an open source project is something that we consider very normal today. Just think of OpenStack or Cloud Foundry, for example, as two very recent examples. And it's very much, but at that time, this was really the very first time this had been tried. And it's obviously been a big part of our success to have this notion of an industry consortium that is commercializing the technology married to a collection of open source projects. But it's hard to exaggerate how innovative that was at the time. But it's also, if you want to get a sort of mental picture of how tough the software industry is, these were the original founders of the Eclipse consortium. And of those company logos, there's only 2 of those which still exist as independent companies. That's IBM and Red Hat. Every other company on that slide has either gone out of business or has been acquired. And obviously, the software industry is very Darwinian. It's a very tough and competitive environment. And Eclipse made some immediate impacts on the market in ways that are hard to overstate. Now, this is one of my favorite views on this. Is this came from Japan? So in 2002, the survey in Japan on which tools were you using, Eclipse is hardly even a blip, right? It's like 1%. 2 years later, in the Japanese market, in the same market, it had gone from 1% thinking of trying it next year to 61% of the market using it. That's a huge switch, right? Any technology that goes from 0 to over 60% in 2 years is obviously got rockets on the back of it. And I think that really speaks to the power of developers making choices, being able to acquire open and free technology, and voting with their feet. And I think that's really what Eclipse allowed the Java developers to do, was they could download and get Eclipse. And it was to the point where Forrester Research, an analyst at this would have been around 2004, 2005, an analyst at Forrester called Carl Zeddy did a study, and he actually measured the difference between what the managers thought their developers were using and what their developers were actually using. Because the managers had all gone and spent huge amounts of money buying Borland JBuilder or WebGain Studio, so they said, oh yeah, we're completely a Borland shop. And meanwhile, 60 or 70% of the developers were using Eclipse because they could just download it, install it, and away they went. So there's a huge difference there. So Eclipse was launched in 2001. In 2004, the Eclipse Foundation was created. And again, you know, if IBM and a group of companies in the consortium are going to go to all the trouble of creating a foundation, there has to be some motivation. And fundamentally, the motivation was that the IBM's goals for Eclipse, which was to become, you know, the platform for Java development, actually wasn't working out as well as they had hoped. And the reason why that was true was because the Eclipse project was still an IBM project. Even though it was open source, the governance was IBM. You know, most of the people that were working on it were IBM. So IBM's direct competitors in the marketplace, and the ones that really mattered were BEA and Borland, wouldn't touch Eclipse because they said, I'm sorry, it's like you guys, it's still an IBM show. We're not going to use it. So they went to the trouble of creating the Eclipse Foundation. That was launched it was announced in February 2004. I came on as first executive director in May of 2004. And it really worked. You know, a year later, in February 2005, BEA and Borland, Sybase, a couple others, Wind River, all joined the Eclipse Foundation as strategic members and all switched their tooling products to start using Eclipse. And that really shows the power of a truly independent and vendor-neutral foundation. And that's one of the, you know, we at Eclipse, the people who work at the foundation, always talk about this notion of vendor neutrality and how important it is to be independent. And this shows that if you have an organization that is truly independent and vendor neutral, then direct competitors can feel confident that they can come and participate at that open source community. And to a large degree, that's why organizations like Eclipse, and Apache is another excellent example, that's why these organizations exist. They exist to enable the collaboration of companies and individuals on new technology platforms. But it is important to remember that this isn't just about the companies. Like I've been talking about sort of the politics and of the industry up to this point, but there are some fantastic people behind the Eclipse project as well. So the guy at the front there with the big red nose, that's Mike Wilson, commonly known as McHugh. So he was the PMC leader for the Eclipse project for many years and has been involved. You know, everybody in that car are members of the Eclipse team. And so it's important to remember that Eclipse is not just about the company politics, but there is a really fun and vibrant group of people that work very hard to make software that you guys get to use for free. So Eclipse has become pervasive in the Java developer community. You know, here's some old numbers. You know, back over 70%, roughly 70%. This is from that study at Forrester that I referenced earlier. And it's been, you know, the competition didn't go down without a fight. We had great fun for a couple of years. We had EclipseCon in California, and the NetBeans folks would send the NetBeans girls over, handing out water and NetBeans DVDs at the front door of EclipseCon. And that gave us, by the way, the best ever splash screen that Eclipse ever had. That picture was actually our splash screen for an integration build for Eclipse. Just having a little bit of fun with the competition. And if you look at terms of what Eclipse has done in changing the landscape for Java development tools, right? This is the list of Java development tools that were available out there in 2005, so 4 years after Eclipse had started. And I've crossed out all the ones that have disappeared since. And so, I mean, really today, when you talk about Java development, it's pretty much sort of a 3.5 horse race, right? There's Eclipse, there's NetBeans, there's IntelliJ, and for the people that are building Oracle applications, you use JDeveloper. And that's pretty much it. And then, well, of course, then there's, you know, various just editors as opposed to the full-blown IDEs. And so it's Eclipse and the other open source survivors have really changed the landscape. So where are we today? First, I must drink some water. So, I mean, it's hard to exaggerate how pervasive Eclipse is. We get used everywhere. We get used, DevOps for kids with their Minecraft stuff uses Eclipse as the tooling platform for doing Minecraft mods. We're raising the next generation of young people that are learning Java and Eclipse through that program, which I think is awesome. We get used on the space station. So this is a NASA astronaut. That gadget in the front actually runs an Eclipse RCP application for doing scientific experiments. And it's a great talk from Tamara Cohen that she's done a couple of years at Eclipse, where she walks through how you have to dumb down a user interface to be used in zero gravity. It turns out that things like a mouse just starts floating away, right? And being able to control a user interface in zero gravity is a completely different experience than what we've gotten used to on planet Earth. Another one they do on the space station, again, another RCP application, is they use it as a mission planning platform for, they're doing experiments in preparation for going to Mars, where they're in orbit in the space station going around Earth, controlling robots on the ground. So they're learning how to deal with robot control. And again, it's all the mission planning there is used with Eclipse, particularly Eclipse RCP. So I mean, Eclipse, both as a tool set and as a platform for rich client platform development, has become ubiquitous. It's everywhere from teaching little kids all the way up to space. But one of the biggest changes that's happened within the Eclipse community since we got started is the diversity of projects that we now have. So Eclipse, the definition of what is an Eclipse project has been evolving for as long as I've been in this job. Originally, to be an Eclipse project, it had to be a plugin for the tools platform. And then the rich client platform came along, and the Eclipse project was a plugin that worked with RCP. Then Equinox came along and we became an OSGI runtime, and then it was basically, if it was Java and it was on the server, then it could be an Eclipse project. And now we've basically given up, and any piece of technology in any programming language that wants to be part of the Eclipse community and work with the Eclipse development process and our IP management can become an Eclipse project. So we have projects now implemented in JavaScript, in Node.js, in Lua, in C and C++. And so we're growing a lot of projects in a lot of areas that people just don't think of as the Eclipse domain. And we're pretty big. Last year we had 130 million lines of code add, change, delete at Eclipse, which is actually down a little bit from a couple of years ago, where I think our peak was 3-4 years ago, where it was like 160 million. And by any definition, that much code velocity is quite significant. The other thing that's really changed is that now the top contributing group at Eclipse is not a company. It's not IBM, Oracle, or SAP, which are the biggest three companies in terms of contribution. It's the individuals. And it's been a big change for Eclipse, that it's much more of a diverse and developer-driven organization than when we started 10 years ago. In terms of members, we're at 213, I think we are at now. So very, an enormous cross-section of the IT industry around the world are supporting the Eclipse Foundation. And I think we've built a very well-deserved reputation as a good and safe place for both individuals and companies to come together to collaborate on open source projects. So a great example is the Eclipse Web Tools, where you've got IBM, Oracle, SAP, Red Hat, all collaborating together on the same project. And the idea of having IBM, SAP, and Oracle collaborating on anything just isn't really typical. Those companies really don't like each other most of the time. But at Eclipse, they feel very comfortable coming together, and they're all shipping products based on the Eclipse Web Tools platform. Another one that's very successful at Eclipse, and probably one of our most diverse projects, is the Eclipse C and C++ development tools. And by the way, these logos, I couldn't even fit all of the logos on the slide, but it's, we've got a very wide range of embedded software companies and Google and the like, all contributing to the Eclipse CDT project, and an enormous ecosystem of products that are being built on top of it. Like I said earlier, if you are in the embedded software development, there's a very good chance that you think of Eclipse as a C tool as opposed to a Java tool. And the Eclipse Foundation itself as an organization has evolved quite a bit over the last 10 years. And what do we do? We have 22 people on staff now at the Eclipse Foundation. We actually just created a Eclipse Foundation Europe a couple of months ago. And so what does the foundation really do? And basically, this is the 5 things that we focus on: is we manage the IP, we help run the projects, help get them started, we run the licensing model, we make sure that the infrastructure is up. We actually have a better sort of track record for keeping our infrastructure up and running than GitHub does, which I think is kind of funny in a way, because they make money doing it. And we do everything we can to help foster the community and ecosystem. But one of the things that Eclipse has done over the last 10, 11 years that is pretty unique is, this will be the 11th year in a row where we have shipped our major annual release on time to the day. And okay, so how many people here, put your hands up if you've shipped your code every year on time to the day for 11 years? Anybody? You work for an automotive company, don't you? That's the one line that doesn't work at an automotive talk. But generally speaking, if you have an organization with the maturity to be able to ship that predictably, you're doing something pretty well. And I often do this talk where I go to industrials, companies that think of open source organizations as sort of the garage band of software, and to do this talk about how it is that we have this mature process that allows us to ship on time to the day every year. And they're really quite amazed that you can coordinate the activities of hundreds of developers. I think it's usually somewhere around 400 developers, maybe 28 countries around the world, 30 or 40 companies, all contributing to this delivery, and we hit the date every single year. Another thing that's changed at Eclipse is we're very focused on creating working groups. So we have these working groups that some of which you basically can't even tell they're part of the Eclipse community. Polar Sys and Location Tech are good examples. And they're working under the Eclipse umbrella, but they have their own identity and their own set of projects. So this has been a big area of growth for Eclipse. Another thing that we've done is we've completely rebuilt our infrastructure for how we build Eclipse over the last couple of years. So we switched from CVS to Git. We've adopted Maven. We're using Hudson. We used Garrett. So we completely overhauled the development infrastructure for the committers that are working on Eclipse projects. So in terms of where we are today, latest numbers show that Eclipse is being used by 68% of Java developers, so it's still very high in terms of market share. So we're right up there with the others. I mean, this is one of these surveys where people pick more than one. There is a more recent survey where they said, what is the one you used the most? And Eclipse was right around 50%. So it's very much, Eclipse is still very, very popular and used within the Java community. So where do we go next? So what's some interesting stuff that's happening at Eclipse coming up? I got no idea. And what I mean by that is the Eclipse Foundation, despite the fact that we can do things like ship on time every year, we're not a top-down company in the normal sense of a software company. The capacity that Eclipse has and the directions that it takes is completely driven by the people and the companies that show up and contribute good developers and good code. And there's really no limit to where we can do and how much we can do, because we don't try at the foundation to do any sort of top-down control. It really is much more like an organic process. And really, it very much is like, as Linus Torvalds says, is what works survives and what doesn't work goes away. We consciously create projects at Eclipse that we have doubts will survive. And that's because we don't want to try to predict what success will be and what it won't be. It's, you know, you can always be wrong. So the community is the capacity. Where Eclipse goes, what it does, what new areas it breaks into is going to be entirely determined by the contributions that flow into Eclipse. But I do have some ideas on a couple of trends that I think would be worth talking about. So trend number one is that software is eating the world. And this phrase, software is eating the world, originally came from a blog post by Mark Andreessen, where he was actually talking about Silicon Valley companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter and so on, where they were using software to make big piles of money, primarily in the social aspects of the computer industry. But I actually think that the more interesting context is the industrial one, where basically all of the traditional industries are being eaten by software. You know, aerospace, railway, logistics, automotive, all of these industries that have historically thought of themselves as mechanical or electrical engineering are being converted into software organizations. And just to give you a couple of examples, if you look at the amount of software that goes into an Airbus, it's gone up several orders of magnitude just in the last decade, right? And they have a real particular problem, which is if you're Airbus and you build airplanes, you just go through the example of the Airbus A320. It started in '72. They made them until 2007. That's 35 years. They have to support them until 2050. So that means they have software support horizons of 78 years. When you have to write code that your great-granddaughter is going to be responsible for maintaining, you think about code in a completely different way, right? And the other thing is, you know, just to go back a slide for a second. So the Airbus 300 is the one that's way over here, like, so yeah, 0.023 million lines of code. In other words, they had 23,000 lines of code in the A300. Right? With the A380, it's like 108 million lines of code, and they still have to figure out how to support that for on the order of, you know, 50 or more years. It's a huge problem. And the interesting thing is what they have come to the conclusion of is that the only possible way that they could possibly make this work is to use open source. They did a study, they looked at big company, small company, academia, you name it, they looked at every single alternative. The only opportunity that they think they have a chance to do this is in open source. You know, similar things are happening in the automotive industry, where tons and tons of code are going in the cars. I mean, they're basically mobile computing platforms. And now with things like, you know, adaptive cruise control and so on, you've got more and more interaction between the head unit and the actual control surfaces of the car. It's a very, very fast-changing world where software is becoming more and more important. And we cannot forget about safety. So who here knows the story of the Therac 25? All right, so so put your hand up if you actually consider yourself a professional software developer. All right, so all the ones that call themselves professional software developers who don't know this story, you got to go read this story. Because this is the first device documented to have killed people because of a software bug. And the story of how it happened and basically the triviality of the code error that put the thing into a race condition. This is a linear accelerator. It gives cancer patients doses of radiation. And instead of giving them maybe on the order of 20 to 100 rads, it was giving them on the order of 20,000. So it was a bad bug. But it's a fascinating story. But the point is that we have to think about safety, especially as devices become more and more ingrained in our life. And so the reason why I'm talking about these various aspects is this is what the PolarSys community at Eclipse is working on. They're working on software development tools for safety critical embedded systems with very, very long support cycles. So if that's, by the way, if you work for a company that sort of just fits in that niche, then you might want to consider getting learning more and getting involved. And a lot of this stuff is based on the Eclipse modeling technology that has been so popular over the last number of years. Okay, so next trend. I did just finish a talk that was, the demos didn't really work all that well, but did a talk on the Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things is obviously a huge area of growth. Tens of billions of devices, trillions of dollars, which of course is going to attract every shyster, con man, carpetbagger, and San Francisco hipster to the crowd. There's a lot of silly stuff being written about the Internet of Things, but what the Eclipse Foundation is trying to do very consciously is to create an open source center of gravity for the Internet of Things, with the eye and with the goal of making sure that the Internet of Things is as free and open as humanly possible. Right? If we're going to have devices monitoring and controlling our lives, those devices need to be open source. We all know that open wins, so we're confident that it might take some time, but because developers vote with their feet, as long as we can make technology available from the Eclipse IoT group, which works well and is free and easy to download and get started with, we're confident that this approach is going to work. So we have quite a collection of projects at Eclipse now. We're up to 15 or 16 projects that are working on the IoT. And one of the things to understand is, again, you guys typically think of Eclipse as very much a tools-centric organization. Almost none of the projects that we have at the Eclipse IoT group are tools. They're frameworks, they're runtimes, they're open source implementations of protocols like MQTT, CoAP, lightweight M2M. So if you're doing anything in the IoT space, or even if you, like playing at home with Raspberry Pis or Arduinos or the like, then you should come to iot.eclipse.org and see what's there and try out some of the technology. Trend number 3. Well, there's this thing called the cloud, and apparently it's pretty important and it's not going away. And the amount of development that's happening in the cloud, not for the cloud, but in the cloud, is going to dramatically increase. So this estimate from Evans Research, I'm surprised that they found that 18% of developers work in the cloud today. I would expect that number to actually be smaller. But they predict that in a couple of years, the majority of developers are going to be working in the cloud. The cloud has actually been a pretty interesting success for the Eclipse Foundation. No matter which cloud vendor you work with, whether it's Amazon, Google, Cloud Foundry, Salesforce, Red Hat with their OpenShift, or even Microsoft with Windows Azure, right? They all use Eclipse as their tool. Windows doesn't use it for, obviously they don't use it for C#, but if you're programming in PHP or Java and targeting Windows Azure, they're going to point you at Eclipse as their tools. But we always thought that there's something fundamentally wrong with this picture, in the sense that, okay, come and work on our cloud, and the first thing you do is go and download 200 megabytes of desktop IDE and configure it, and then you can start working on the cloud, or for the cloud. And we actually, so a number of years ago, started a project at Eclipse, and a number of the developers are right here in Krakow. And a couple of them are in the room. But Orion as a technology is intended to be a next generation tooling platform. And so what Orion does is it allows you to have decent development tools that work right in your browser. And there's a sort of a joke internally at the Eclipse Foundation. Whenever I say something is dumb or impossible, then it automatically, I'm wrong, and it becomes true. And I can remember when I first heard the idea of putting tools in the browser, I really strongly doubted that that would ever be possible or ever make sense. And one of the reasons why I turned out to be completely wrong is how much better the browsers have gotten over the last 5-8 years. With things like V8 and much faster, higher performance JavaScript engines, the browsers as a tooling platform have dramatically improved over the last number of years. So we think Orion is pretty cool, but there are some challenges. And one is, nobody really yet knows what cloud-based development is truly going to be like. We're all learning together. I saw this one blog post by a guy named Tyler Jewell at Code Envy, where I think he counted, was it 47 or 57? We'll call it 50, plus or minus, web IDEs out there today. Obviously not all of these are going to survive, but all of them are useful experiments to try to figure out how is web development really going to evolve. And the other thing is that none of them at this point do a particularly good job of supporting compiled languages like Java. Most of the ones that are out there are focusing on things like JavaScript, and Orion is one of those. The other thing is that there's been over 30 years of investment in your desktop tools. And it seems like it's going to be pretty unlikely that we're going to be able to leave 30 years of investment behind like that, right? It's going to take some time for the web-based tools to mature before you can actually switch all of your development over. So leaving everything behind in one fell swoop is going to be pretty tough. And if that's really what we need to do to enable web-based development, it's going to slow things down a lot. So we've been working at Eclipse on a new project. Did my thing just go off? Oh, here we go. Called Flux, that tries to integrate the world of Orion with the world of the desktop Eclipse. And if the demo gods are on my side, here we go. What I've got running here, so this is Orion. This is the Orion editor. I'm sorry. This is Eclipse. Duh. Trying to go too fast here. This is the Orion editor running in a Chrome browser. So what we have here is, two copies of the same file. What Flux is trying to do is think of it as sort of Dropbox for your code. The vision is to provide a seamless integration between your desktop tools and your web-based tools, with the notion that you want to be able, as a developer, you want to be able to work on your code on the device that you have where you are. And that could be a tablet sitting in front of the television, or it could be a desktop at your office. And so what a Flux is doing is hooking up the Orion editor to your desktop IDE. And the goal over time is to turn this into much more of a microservices framework and take what you think of today as the Eclipse workbench and make that a headless server that can run in the cloud. But as you start to type, you can immediately see that the error marker came up in the Orion editor. So this is Orion hooked up to compiled Java support. With actual code completion. Actually, I just realized this isn't. So you've got actual navigation. So I can navigate to the definition for that class. And I can do the work where sort of better example, where I can change all of the for simple refactoring, refactor all of the code at once. So this is a full example of Orion running in conjunction with the Eclipse desktop tool. Of course, demo gods are not on my side today, and the thing that actually is the most interesting part of this demo is where you're, what's that? Just save? Yeah, there we go. Ah, okay, so it's resynced. Okay. So that's where we're going with Flux. So part of the trend, now trend number 3 is to enhance the tools to bring them together, whether you're talking desktop or in the cloud, to make sure that you have a seamless tooling platform across both sides of the equation. And so in closing, Eclipse is still very, very popular. Our core franchise is still very much with the Java developer. Of course, we're growing in leaps and bounds in other areas like the Internet of Things, as we saw with PolarSys. Also, there's another one called Location Tech, which is working in the geospatial area. So there's an enormous amount of interesting things happening at Eclipse. So earlier I said I have no idea where Eclipse is going, and in some ways I don't, because it really is going to be evolved by the bottom up by where the developers take it. But frankly, you are the capacity. So if you're using Eclipse today, and consider yourself part of the broader Eclipse community and figure out how to get engaged. We're always looking for smart people to help work on the Eclipse, on any of the Eclipse projects, but of course on the Eclipse platform and the Eclipse Java tools as well. So I highly encourage everyone in this room to think about how they can get engaged with Eclipse and help steer it in the direction that you think is important. Because at the center of the Eclipse Foundation is the community. It's the reason why we do everything that we do. And I hope that you guys will feel part of the Eclipse community. And that slide is out of date. And so thank you. So I hope that that gave you sort of an overview of some ideas of where Eclipse has been and where it's going in the future. And I appreciate your time. Thank you. I think we have time for questions if anybody has one. Yeah. So, I mean, frankly, if you think that IntelliJ is great for you, then by all means continue to use it. I mean, actually, one of the funny things in life is the two guys that are the sales force for IntelliJ in the US are two good friends of mine that I used to work with at WebGain. I don't consider IntelliJ the enemy at all. They're doing what they're doing. We have a lot of work to do at Eclipse to compete better with them. I mean, frankly, over the last couple of years, they've improved a lot, and we've only improved a little. So they're challenging us, and I think that's competition is good. And so I'm not going to tell you to switch off of IntelliJ. Were you expecting me to? Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, so the first question is, are we considering getting rid of SWT and JFace as the UI frameworks for the Eclipse desktop? And the short answer is no, we don't have any plans to do so at this moment. If we were, I think the only logical thing would be Java FX. But I mean, there's no resources or no decision to go in that direction. I do find it ironic that Steve Northover, who is the inventor of SWT, now works for Oracle on Java FX. So we have some good friends over there at least. But yeah, there's certainly no plans at this time. It would be obviously a very large job to switch off of SWT. But I couldn't, if we were, I couldn't imagine doing anything other than Java FX. So that's, and the second question was, what do we do when we run out of names of moons for our releases? Actually, so we actually haven't really used, we're not using moons anymore. So we're with the astronomical names. So last year was Kepler. This year is Luna, so that's, but next year is Mars. So we're sticking with the astronomical theme, but we actually gave up on the moons. Originally, when we started with Callisto, the idea was that Jupiter alone has 40 moons or something, and we were going to go through the Jupiter moons. Turns out most of the names are not that useful. Eclipse Eleutherus it just doesn't really roll off the tongue. Well, I guess we'll have to wrap. I guess, so after Eclipse Zebra, it will have to be Eclipse Aardvark. Any other questions? All right, thank you.